for today is from Judges chapter 2, verses 16 to 21. Then the Lord raised up judges, who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemy all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judges died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because these people have transgressed my covenant that I have commanded to their ancestors, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Okay, so the last couple of weeks I have been talking about how some of the books in the Old Testament have been edited over time. You know, different time periods in Israel's history, the people would come back and look at these and they would kind of reinterpret what had happened and then kind of make some edits in it. And so Judges is another one of those that has edits in it and has stories that kind of follow one stream of thought and then stories that follow another stream of thought. And it's kind of confusing. And actually kind of Friday, when I went to pick Brianna up, she came up for the weekend. When I went to pick her up, I ran across this sign. Some of y'all have probably seen this. It's getting close to San Ysidro. Between San Ysidro and Bernalillo is a sign that says, "Don't give up. 1-800-QUIT-NOW." Don't give up. 1-800-QUIT-NOW. So it's kind of a confusing sign, isn't it? But if you actually know what the sign's about, you can kind of figure out what it means. It's about smoking. But when you first see it, and especially because, you know, I couldn't tell that those two little white sticks were cigarettes, it's like, what is this about? 1-800-QUIT-NOW, but don't give up. So, Judges actually has some of that same stuff going on, where once you kind of know the overarching theme, it makes sense, but parts of it as you read it don't. And the main point of Judges is we need a king. But it looks like what originally happened with Judges were these stories they had of some of their different, I guess, heroes, we would call them, but they were the different judges. And judges, by the way, had nothing to do really with the law system like we think of it now. They were usually military leaders. So those are what they call judges. They did serve a function in, you know, between debates and arguments and stuff like that, making decisions, but their main role really was military. And so they had this collection of these stories, the different tribes, and they put them all together in this one book. But then people started trying to tie all of this together. And then someone eventually came along and used it to make a point. And their point was, hey, we need a king. Well, kind of what ends up happening as you read it is you see this one voice that says the reason that you guys are failing at the conquest is what Grace read for us, is that you didn't trust God all the way. But they have their own excuses as to why they're failing at the conquest. And it's those excuses I want to look at today. And these are the reasons that they gave. If you read all of Judges, these are the reasons that they gave why they were failing at the conquest. And the first reason that I ran across is that they started pointing to the other guy, the Canaanites, and saying, but God, they have chariots of iron. Now back then, chariots of iron were like you going out on horseback and they've got tanks. Now, we know that every once in a while the tanks get overthrown by the people on horseback, but what usually happens? Yeah, the tanks usually win. So they're scared to death as they're looking around at these other countries that they still need to go and take, and they're saying, oh, the ones on the plains have these chariots of iron. Let's just avoid them for now. Now, did they need anything when they took Jericho? Remember how they took Jericho? They marched around it for 6 days in a row, and then on the 7th day, they blew the trumpet and they shouted and the walls came down. Would it have mattered if the other guys had chariots? It wouldn't have mattered, right? It wouldn't have mattered one bit. The fact is that God was going to win all the battles for them. But over time, they started looking at the opposition and it started scaring them, especially these ones with chariots of iron. And so this is actually in Judges 1, verse 19. It says, the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. Do you think that excuse worked for God? When they went to God and said, God, you told us that we could take this land, but they've got chariots. Now I want to point out, here's what's already been said back in Joshua. But the hill country shall be yours, for though it is a forest, you shall clear it and possess it to its furthest borders. For you shall drive out the Canaanites, though they have chariots of iron, and though they are strong. God's already told them he will drive out these chariots of iron. But as soon as they actually see one, they look at it and say, oh man, that's big. Oh man, that thing's made of iron. That's just not going to be that easy. Maybe God really hadn't looked at these chariots of iron before he promised that we could take them. The second reason that they give is that we aren't strong enough. And what they say is when Israel grew strong, blah, 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 and I'll read the rest of it in a second, but when Israel grew strong. So there were periods of time where they obviously didn't feel like they were strong. So there are times in their history, they're sitting there saying, well, God, I'll do it tomorrow when there's more of us. Or when we finish whatever maneuvers we're working on, whatever military tactics we're trying to come up with. Did that matter at Jericho? Did it matter at Ai? Did it matter at any other of the places they have taken so far? But suddenly they put on the brakes and they say to God, God, today we're not strong enough. I can't do it today. God, if you counted how many of us there is, we're about 100 men short. And when we get that extra 100 men or 1,000 men or whatever it was they felt like they needed, then they were willing to go and follow what God had asked them to do. But not today. Today they're just not quite ready. Moving on in that same passage, it says, when Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not, in fact, drive them out. So at some point, they finally get their extra 100 men they felt like they needed to be strong enough now to actually drive out the Canaanites as they've been commanded to do by God. And instead, they settle for just putting them to forced labor. Now, it doesn't give us all the specifics on why they chose to do that. Perhaps they were just sitting here thinking, man, I hate building stuff. I hate putting props in. I hate picking olives. What if instead of destroying all the Canaanites like God commanded us to do, what if we just make them into forced labor? And someone else said, you know, that sounds like a great idea. Why don't we do that? Or perhaps they just didn't feel strong enough to actually complete all of the command that God had given them. But for whatever reason, they got to a point where they said, instead of doing everything God has told us to do, we'll just put them to forced labor, and maybe God will decide that's okay. Maybe God will look at what we've done and say, well, that's close to what I said, so sure. That'll work. No problem. And then finally, they started saying we need a king. And they say this quite a bit, over and over they say. And actually this ends up becoming, like I said, the main theme of Judges. They start putting this on every single account And like I said, they were probably individual stories of these different judges. And at the beginning and end of almost every one of these, they make a note. And here's one of the notes they made. The people worshiped the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. The next one. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted them and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them, and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. And then they end Judges. This is the final word, the final verse in Judges, and it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. So what they're trying to tell God is, God, this isn't our fault that we can't do this. It's because you won't give us a king. All the other nations around us have kings and they're successful, but we don't have a king, so we're not successful. So we need a king. We need somebody else to do this for us. We need somebody else to organize this. We need someone else to plan all this out. Now, God has promised to do all of this for him, hasn't he? God has promised to take care of these iron chariots. He's promised to take care of them as long as they will remain faithful. But they're struggling when they actually look at the problem. When they actually see the problem right in front of them, they say, that's bigger than I realized it was going to be. It's harder than I realized it was going to be. It's taking a lot longer than I realized it would take. And so their faith falters. And really, if we summed it all up, what would we say? They didn't trust God. Had they trusted God, in hindsight, we can read this whole thing and we can say, look, when you guys trusted God, you didn't even have to raise a finger and the walls were falling down. But when you quit trusting God, things fell apart. It's easy in hindsight to look at them and say they weren't doing a good job. Guys, aren't we sometimes these people? Are there spots in our own lives where God has said, hey, I want you to deal with this in your life? This thing in your life, this temptation, this habit, this problem, whatever it may be, we run into some of the same problems. Is there anywhere in your life right now that you're saying, I can't, but really what you mean is I won't? Because that's what the Israelites were doing. They had this long list of all these reasons why they couldn't do it, but really God knew the truth was that they wouldn't do it. They could do it because God was with them. God was willing to do it with them. But the fact is they wouldn't do it. And it's easy for us to look at them and say, you guys were really weak. But they were just human like us. This is our story too. We struggle with the same things. We see our problems and they look too big, they look too hard, they take too long. And we also struggle and falter. So, here's some of the reasons that if we think about it, if you heard yourself say some of these, you might find out that you're saying can't instead of I won't do it instead of I can't do it. And has anyone ever found themselves saying no one can conquer this thing? I say it quite a bit. Every time I pass a Taco Bell. Every single one of them, all three of them, lined up on Main Street, just for me. So, I can't conquer it because God keeps putting Taco Bells everywhere. So, when we find ourselves saying that this is not something that we can conquer, this is not something I can do, then we might be in that spot where we're saying, no, I won't do it. Or if we find ourselves saying, I'm not strong enough. Guilty of that one myself as well. Feeling weak, especially if you fail and fail and fail and fail. After a while, I'm just kind of feeling like I can't do it. I'm just not strong enough to overcome this in my life. The next one, I conquered part of that. Isn't that good enough? I've conquered some of my bad habit. Isn't that good enough? You know, if we're hot, someone could throw the fans on and maybe throw the... It's cold when I come over here at 7.
You want the fans on?
Yes, why don't we, I see people fanning themselves, why don't we throw in the swamp cooler and the fans?
It's just a hot sermon, that's it.
It's the unlabeled fan at the bottom on the left. There you go. And then the swamp coolers, yeah, there you go. Just turn it on. All right. So I conquered part of that. Isn't it good enough? It's easy to fall into complacency when we're struggling with something and feel like I've done some of it and it's too hard. Maybe this is enough. Maybe I don't need to go any further. You gotta really.
I did part of it, I can't do the rest.
She showed. Very good. I now know she's listening. All right, and the last one is I need someone else to do it for me. Or I need someone else to guide me through it. I need some kind of help to get through it. And the thing, you may need help to get through it. Over there. They sometimes stick. So they don't just stop. So, all right. So these are some of the things that sometimes we find ourselves saying, and it's okay to think. Yeah, there you go. Sometimes in our lives, you know, we look back and we read these stories from the Old Testament, and it's easy for us to judge these people and say, well, they failed. Well, they just trusted God. And the truth is, these are stories about our own lives. These are stories about us. There you go. That'll be enough of them. All right.
That's all.
Nathaniel, that's good. So, thank you. So I don't, Nathaniel, that's good.
You don't want to break it.
Yeah, you're turning it the wrong way. Even. Nathaniel,
Come sit down.
Nathaniel, please stand
One
up.
over.
Yeah, some of them stick because they paint, so it's been wet.
Sorry.
So what I don't want us to do is judge these people in the Old Testament, the Israelites, and say, you know, I would have done better. Because these are our stories. These are stories we share in common with the Israelites, in that when we are actually faced with a problem, you know, it's easy to stand and when we're praying and God says, hey, I want you to do this and I'll be with you and I'll help you overcome. I mean, boy, we're all fired up and we're all motivated, and then we actually step out of our little prayer cubicle into the real world and we look at that thing and suddenly it's big, it's made of iron, can't do it by ourselves, and we find that maybe halfway is good enough because it is hard. These weren't easy, they were hard things for them to do, and we all struggle with these very, very hard things to do in our life. And so when we read these stories, we want to give them some grace and not judge them, but at the same time walk away and say, okay, here's the lesson I learned from that. It's just not that easy sometimes. And I might fail, and I might fail, and I might fail. But I'm going to trust in the end and get back up and keep trying. Because God's made us a promise. So if God has made a promise somewhere in your life that He's going to help you overcome something, He has not promised that He will help you talk about it. It just hasn't happened. But I'm sure it's coming any day now, right? But if God has made you a promise that He will help you with something, then God will. But we're going to go through some rough spots until we get there. We're going to go through some hard spots. But we can trust and believe that God will get us all the way through. All right? Amen, right?